Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this afternoon's session. I'm Yalda Hakim, and I'll be your host this afternoon. We've been discussing a lot about great power competition today, and if the return of great power rivalry is the central challenge of our time, then it's the oceans of the Indo-Pacific that are the central front of this evolving struggle. And it's a struggle that has many dimensions, including the economic, ideological, and technological. But critical is the military balance of power, and that is the subject of this afternoon's panel. And with us here to discuss are military leaders from across the region and the world. And I'd like to introduce them. Admiral Lanba, India's Chief of Naval Staff; Admiral Davidson, Commander, US Indo-Pacific Command; Admiral Prajuk, France's Chief of Naval Staff; Admiral Kawano, Chief of Joint Staff, Japan Self-Defense Forces; and General Campbell, Australia's Chief of the Defence Force. Admiral Lanba, I'd like to begin with you, because the number 1, 2, and 3 concerns of this region, the Pacific and the Indian Ocean region, are China, China, and China. And in the last 5 years, China has become militarily more capable and active in the Indian Ocean region. So from the Indian perspective, the Indian military perspective, what are the Chinese up to, and what are you doing about it?
Since 2008, there has been a permanent presence of the Chinese Navy in the Indian Ocean region in the form of an anti-piracy escort force. The 31st anti-piracy escort force is presently in the Gulf of Aden. So at any given time, there are 6 to 8 Chinese Navy ships in the northern part of the Indian Ocean. Also, 2 years ago, they commissioned the first overseas facility or base in Djibouti. The stated aim of this deployment is to protect their trade, which is flowing through this area for piracy. They've deployed submarines for anti-piracy operations, which is the most unlikely platform to be used for this role. There is no doubt they are spending a huge sum of money in developing their military capability. They're modernizing their forces, they're modernizing the command structure. And in my opinion, the Chinese, no navy has grown so rapidly in the last 200 years as the Chinese Navy. They've added 80 new ships in the last 5 years. So the Chinese Navy is a force, and it is a force which is here to stay.
Admiral Prajuk, I'll just bring you into this conversation because Admiral Lanba's just raised the issue of Djibouti, and it feels like everyone's building a base in Djibouti. I mean, the US are there, the Japanese are there, and the French. And of course, the Chinese now have a military base there as well. You've been in Djibouti the longest. I mean, do you have concerns that the Chinese are trying to push you out?
Many countries are in Djibouti, and there is room for many countries. Why everyone wants to be in Djibouti? Because the ocean is not the empty thing you see from the shore.
Can you put on your mic?
Okay.
Start again.
Everybody wants to be in Djibouti because Djibouti is close to Bab el-Mandeb, a choke point. In the ocean is not something uniform that you see from the shore and empty. It's something with, it's an area with specific geometries. Dots, slots, and stocks. Dots are choke points, places where you can interrupt, close the trading of the ship. They are not numerous. They link generally seas and oceans. The Suez Canal, Bab el-Mandeb, Hormuz, Dundra Head, the Cape of Good Hope, Malacca, Sunda Strait. They are strategic places because this is the place where, with the minimum amount of force, you can stop the shipping, which is necessary, strategic to our prosperity. The second geometric feature you can find in the ocean is a slock. A slock is a sea line of communications. When you see the ocean from the shore, it seems empty. But in fact, it's probably as crowded as Old Delhi in the afternoon. But the ships are not scattered randomly. They are not covering the whole ocean. They are following ways on the ocean. These ways, these lines of communications are links between the choke points, between the dots. We call them the sea lines of communications. They are generally in international waters, so they are vulnerable. You have to protect them. You have to defend them, especially, for example, in the Gulf of Aden, when the piracy was at its most. And the last feature, geometric feature you find in the ocean, I call it stock. Stock of fishes, stock of hydrocarbons, stock of rare earth. And they are in our economic exclusive zone that are defined by UNCLOS, UN Nation Convention for the Law of the Sea. So these are large areas, and France has a quarter of its EEZ, Exclusive Economic Zone, in the Indian Ocean, in the southern Indian Ocean, and more than the half of it in the Pacific Ocean. So we are very interested in the protection of these stocks. We are very interested in the protection of the slocks, because our prosperity, the way we live every day, depends on the maritime security along these slocks, and we are concerned with the security of the choke points, of the dots. This is why we have a base in Djibouti and a base in Abu Dhabi.
But specifically on China, I mean, are you worried about Chinese presence in Djibouti?
Well, we are observing, monitoring the change in the strategic landscape, and as Admiral Lamba said, the Chinese Navy is growing very fast and is present since 2008 in an area where it hasn't been present for centuries. So we have to understand, interpret what is going on, what is new in the area.
Admiral Davidson, I'll come to you. I mean, this past year, the name of your command was changed from Pacific Command to Indo-Pacific Command. Just tell us about that change and what it represents.
Yeah, thank you for the question, and I apologize for my voice. I brought this from Hawaii here to Delhi. Thank you for the question. I think, as everyone knows, the day I took over, then Secretary Mattis announced that he was changing the name of the headquarters from U.S. Pacific Command to U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. I think it more accurately describes absolutely the responsibilities that the headquarters has. But most importantly, it articulates much of what President Trump put out at the end of 2017, that the future of prosperity, not only for the United States, but really for all nations of the region, is resident in the Indo-Pacific. And the name change is to help support that vision and certainly describe the responsibilities that the headquarters has.
We're just speaking here on the panel about China's military capability, and you and I were both at Halifax this year.
Yes.
And when I spoke to General Dunford, we discussed the National Defense Strategy and also the Commission report on that NDS report, and also about the concern about declining American military edge. I mean, the report itself is incredibly alarming and sobering. So in your view, what are the technologies and capabilities required to maintain the balance of power, especially in this region?
Well, certainly the capabilities that are required are able to dominate in all domains. So investments certainly at sea and in air, on land, but in the future, cyberspace and space are critically important. These are capabilities that not only the United States is interested, but I know my allies and partners are as well. Most importantly, the capability set that I think must be displayed and put in the battle space is the set of alliances and partnerships that we're all capable of. As we look back on the more than 7 decades now, taking us back to World War II, It's been allies and partners that have come together in crisis, not to conquer others, but to liberate them. And we've proved time and time again that a strategic partnership and a set of alliances will triumph for the good of the global stability.
But certainly as far as the president is concerned, he's often said that the United States is the one doing the heavy lifting. So can we talk a little bit about burden sharing? I mean, do you feel that that is the case?
My experience so far in command, Indo-Pacific Command, the last 7 months is I feel well supported by others in the region. It's no secret that our operations in the South China Sea are frequent. I would note that in the last 8 months, certainly Japan, France, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the UK, they've all operated in the South China Sea. I think that's an important demonstration to not only assert the rights of all nations to the freedom of the seas in that critical waterway, but to assure the nations along the rim of the South China Sea, indeed all of ASEAN and others, whose lifelines are critical on the communications in that seaway, that they can operate there too as well.
Admiral Kawano,
Yes.
I'll come to you now. The past year has witnessed a warming in diplomatic relations between Japan and China after a period of high tension. And this, of course, came after Prime Minister Abe's visit to China in October. Has that then translated to any reduction in Chinese aggressive activity in the East China Sea? East China Sea, yeah.
はい。まず我々東シナ海でも中国と厳しく対峙しております。どうぞ。東シナ海では東シナ海で中国今非常に厳しい対立をしております。対立。
Well, I have to admit that in the East China Sea, is this on?
Yeah.
It is on. In the East China Sea, we do have a very severe conflict with China even now.
それで我々の領では尖閣の領海についても月に2回から3回は領海を侵犯をしている。この状況は変わりません。
So even the area around the Senkaku Islands, they have to see that twice a month we do have these ships, about 2-3 times, we've had these ships coming in around the area of the Senkaku Islands.
で中国の海空軍力の活動の頻度、回数、それと範囲、これも広がっております。
And I have to admit that the activities of the Chinese Air Force not only has the frequency gone up, but also the scope has increased.
ただ一ついい面としては海空連絡メカニズムというのが不測の事態を避けるために中国と締結をしました。
However, there has been one very good outcome, and that is that in order to prevent unexpected collisions or conflicts with China, we have something, we've signed a maritime and aerial communication mechanism.
それと今軍人同士の行き来、それから防衛大臣と向こうの防衛大臣との交流も開始しようということになっております。
And also there has been some movement that we are considering exchange of cadets with China. We're also looking at a mutual visit of defense ministers from both countries to each other.
でこれから対話が進むことを期待しております。
And I am looking forward to a dialogue with China in the future also.
We were just speaking now about the US, the burden sharing and the US doing the heavy lifting. I mean, for years and years, Japan has relied on the United States, but it does feel like now Japan is stepping up militarily. Is that because of a diminished sort of confidence in counting on the US?
まず我々日米安保条約を締結しております。
Firstly, I have to mention that we have a security treaty with America.
ただこれはやはり我々非常に厳しい憲法上の制約がありますので、日米共同対処を基本としております。
So since we have a lot of strict limitations written down in our constitution, so it has to be with Japan and US only.
でただ、日本も経済力が相当ついてきましたので、日本もそれなりの軍事的な役割を負担しなければならないという認識になりました。
However, the fact is that Japan over the years has become economically strong, so we do understand that we will need to share some of the burden, like the military burden also.
でそれで2年前に集団的自衛権を一部認めるという法律改正ができて、我々の軍事行動も広がったということです。
ごめんなさい、その集団的法律、
集団的自衛権、
それは何て言えばいいですか？
コレクティブセルフディフェンスの一部を認める法律ができました。
So, however, just 2 years ago, there has been an amendment in our constitution where in the legislation, which is a little change in the collective self-defense, and because of that, we are able to increase our strength militarily.
General Campbell, I'll finally, thank you, come to you. I mean, how concerned are you about Chinese activity in what has traditionally been your backyard? Papua New Guinea, South Pacific, I mean, we're seeing the base on Manus. What do you think they're up to, and what's Australia doing about it?
Oh, thanks, Yalda. Thanks for the question. I think a number of your questions have premised the uncertainty, perhaps, of China's growth, China's expanding capability and presence. The rate of change in power, the transparency with which that power is used and developed, and the consistency between the words we use and the actions we take, all of those are aspects that either build and can support strategic confidence, security, stability, or can create circumstances of uncertainty and a sense of concern. So what I look to is how we can build community that sees the common features of not just our own self-interest, but our common interest in regions, whether they be across the breadth of the Indo-Pacific, in the particular sense that you're speaking of with regard to our long historic connection to the Southwest Pacific, and to do so in a way that Australia has done everywhere that we've operated. Since Federation as a nation, we only have conducted operations in coalitions of nations, working together with an aspiration to create a better community, a better security environment for us all. So, bilateral relationships that have trilateral connections, the quintrilateral discussion we're having here today, the multilateral effects you see in things like our major naval or air multilateral exercises, Pitch Black and Kakadu. Building an Indo-Pacific community takes work at many levels and in many ways to do so. The Pacific effort that Minister Payne mentioned in her speech looks to strengthening our relationship with Pacific Island nations, often quite fragile in their social, economic, political and environmental circumstances, but not to do so exclusively, rather to recognise that there are many in this room and beyond with interests. But interests that we would ask are always directed towards the question, how better to create that community? And I think that's the approach to take, not just today, but at any era in our community and in our region of the world.
I mean, certainly as an Australian, I know that a lot of Australians say, well, economically, China is incredibly important to us. So why should we bother getting involved in or tangling ourselves up in rivalries between India and China or China and the United States? So I suppose the question is, what assurances can you give Australia's allies and convince Australians that an issue in Djibouti or in Sri Lanka is also of concern to Australia?
Look, that's an interesting question that 60,000 war dead on the Western Front and in Palestine would say Australia has always looked beyond its immediate circumstances to support the security of the world. And we've done it 100 years ago, we've done it throughout our history, and we will continue to do so, to strive to build community. So I would say to you that we've got a pretty good track record as a steadfast ally and partner, and as a nation that works cooperatively for collective outcomes, not unilaterally, and that looks beyond our own immediate self-interest to see that the rules and the order that govern the world are good for all of us as much as they are good for our own countries.
Admiral Davidson, we've got the Quad here on the stage, plus France, of course. The Chinese media has said the Quad, it's dead in the water. Do you believe that there's more to this Quad other than just lip service? I mean, is there going to be a military aspect to this?
Whether we're talking about four nations individually or collectively, I think everyone here, General Campbell just a moment ago has made the point that the multilateral nature of alliances and partnerships enables much more combat power. We, the United States, have a burgeoning relationship with India, indeed a strategic partnership that advanced greatly last year. The naming as a major defense partner in the past, the passing of the COMCASA, or excuse me, the co-signing of the COMCASA just this last fall, is going to enable some technical exchange and ultimately some info sharing that I think will speak to the shared benefit of both our nations.
How worried are you about war with China?
Listen, I think every day that it's my job to make sure that peace comes today, next week, next month, next year.
On that note, I'll open it up to the floor and the audience. There are microphones in the center of the room, so if you can make your way to the microphones, and we'll take 3 or 4 questions and then bring it back to the panel. So I believe we have one here at the front.
Hi, thank you. My question is more towards the Indian and the American admirals. There is a wider consensus on all the 5 countries on the dais on a strategic collaboration on the Indo-Pacific. My question is, are we prepared to perhaps see more strategic collaborations and use maybe some of your islands in maritime collaborations? Can we maybe just, as an example, see joint flights between, or maybe PAIs between Andaman and Nicobar to Diego Garcia?
Okay. Yeah. And we'll take one just there. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Maaike Okena-Heijmans from the Klingendaal Institute in The Hague. I have a question. As you just said, this is a pretty impressive image of the Quad on stage, and having France there now is also an intriguing question of what does that mean for all of us here and for the world. My question, so that's a question I would like to have some answer to. The real question is the comparison with last year, when you were also talking as the Quad countries about economization of the Quad, as I called it, the blue economy, and the link of the Quad going into the economic field, maritime connectivity, if you will. I think some people have called it that. Is there still something of that sort on the agenda? We know, of course, of the Trilateral Investment Fund and the links between your countries indeed in that field. How does that link to the Quad and the maritime element? Thank you.
Okay. And just one question here.
My question is to the Australian Admiral, and it's that we've seen investments in the Southwest Pacific by the Chinese. So is that an issue of concern with the small conglomeration of islands that are there? I mean, not being geopolitically too big to defend themselves. And do you see that as a threat?
General Campbell, I'll let you answer that question, and then I'll go to the other questions.
Sure. Thanks very much for that question. There is development assistance need in the Southwest Pacific that each of the countries that make up that community and individually as nations would welcome. And they are the recipients of donor assistance from many countries, including China. We would simply ask that that assistance from all nations be about building the development, social, economic and political stability and security of those nations, not be to further external strategic ambitions. And where assistance is provided under that mindset, it is extraordinarily beneficial and most welcome by all nations participating and by those nations that they see are also participating in the assistance. Thank you.
Admiral Lumber and Admiral Davidson, there was a question about the Indian-US strategic collaboration and are we likely to see the strengthening of those ties? So the strategic collaboration, the strengthening of the ties between the two nations.
We've been collaborating with each other for decades now, especially the US Navy, the Indian Navy. We first started exercising with each other way back in 1993. A stock exercise called the Malabar now also includes Japan in it. The scale and complexity of this exercise has grown over the years. It's conducted annually. All 5 nations represented out here, India has signed a technical agreement for sharing information on shipping, which has been operationalized, and information flows. So we have a common maritime domain awareness. The lady raised an issue of the Boeing Maritime Patrol aircraft, and the picture which is generated by this aircraft flows into this, and this information is shared between all the 5 of us, and we have a common picture, so we are aware of what is happening in the maritime domain awareness. Our strategic relationship with the United States have grown. We have signed the 2 foundational agreements of Lemova and Comcasa. Like my ships regularly fuel from US Navy tankers when they are deployed somewhere in the Indian Ocean region or even in the Pacific. And it's a growing relationship which is robust, and it will only go as time goes by.
Yeah, very well articulated. I would add, just last month, we shared helicopter operations between Indian and U.S. ships. We hadn't had that done in the past. And I had just taken over at Indo-Pacific Command when we had the Rim of the Pacific exercise in July. India sent a ship who did an absolutely fabulous job in the exercise, both in port and underway. They were really the talk of the whole exercise amongst 36 nations that were there. Shortly after impact, I traveled to Fiji, and I was quite pleased to see the same ship in Fiji. The Prime Minister and I managed to admire the ship a little bit from his offices. So it's a burgeoning relationship, rooted in some 25 years now, and look forward to building on it in the future.
I don't want to keep getting you to talk, but there was another question about the Quad and the blue economy, as well as maritime connectivity on the agenda, whether that's on the agenda at all.
It's not my job to play trade minister, so I won't get into that today. But Admiral Lamba articulated that, and Minister Payne brought it up a little bit earlier. There's an opportunity to enhance our understanding of maritime domain awareness, shared maritime domain awareness. The Fusion Center that's standing up here that India announced is one of those things that I think will help that situational awareness for the two of us, and as Admiral Lamba mentioned, really all of us here.
Can we just hear from Admiral Prajuk, because this year the Indo-French military cooperation really stepped up. Just tell us a little bit more about that and sort of what France is doing in the Indian Ocean.
We are doing many things and more every year with our Indian partners. Before being at the Raisina Dialogue, I spent 2 days with Admiral Lamba and his staff to overview all the spectrum of our cooperation. We have roughly two things: understand what's happening in the Indian Ocean, and then be able to act together if needed in the Indian Ocean. Understand and act. In order to understand, the Indian Navy just opened a few weeks ago an information fusion center in Delhi, and a French officer will join this information fusion center so that we can share the appreciation of the assessment of the situation, of the maritime situation. Who is who on the ocean? Who is trafficking drug? Who is smuggling arms? Who is, okay, we have to share these pictures, and I will have a naval officer inserted in an Indian Navy fusion center. The second thing is act together. When you want to act together, you have to construct what we call interoperability, have the same procedures, have the same radio frequencies. So exercise. We are exercising every year, and this year the French carrier strike group around aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle will come to Indian Ocean, and we're planning a large exercise with the Indian Navy and the probably Indian aircraft carrier. We're doing the same thing with the submarines. We are doing the same thing in a wide spectrum of naval capability, so we'll be able to act together if needed.
Thank you. I'll go back to some questions. Just one here.
Thank you. Excuse me. This question is for Admiral Kawano-san. The end of last year, we saw the carrier JS Kaga come to Sri Lanka, and it called in Singapore on the way back. Now, Sri Lanka is a long way from home for you, Admiral. Recently, you announced that the Izumo class of helicopter carriers will be converted to full carriers. Now, given what Admiral Lamba just said about the massive growth of the Chinese Navy, 80 ships added in the last 5 years, what can we expect from Japan in terms of your own military expansion? And more importantly, do you think that Asia is ready and welcoming of this growth? Thank you.
GS なんとかという船をスリランカに送ったわけなんですけども、スリランカというのは日本から非常に離れているところにあるわけですけれども、またつい最近なんですけども、出雲クラスのキャリア、ヘリコプターのキャリアがフルキャリアにするというアナウンスもあったということなんですけれども、ランバさんが先ほど言ったように、特に中国の軍事力がですね、過去5年間非常に強化しているわけなんですけれども、日本は今後どういうふうにしてやっぱり軍事力を高めるかということなんですけれども、アジアというのがこういったいろんな存在を関係できるための準備ができている。
わかりました。まず我々今言いましたように東シナ海で中国と対立をしております。
Firstly, I would like to say that, as I mentioned earlier also, that we are in conflict with China in the East China Sea.
ただ南シナ海についても我々の重要なシーレーンが通っております。
However, with regard to South China Sea, there is a very important sea lane for us, which goes through the South China Sea.
南シナ海、東シナ海は またインド洋もこれも一つの海としてつながっております。
However, we all know that East China Sea, South China Sea, and the Indian Ocean are all kind of connected together as one ocean. I'm sorry, can't see
したがっ
the
て我々
speaker.
としてはこの南シナ海そしてインド洋の平和と安定にも寄与するというのが我々の国益になると考えています。
However, we feel that it is our responsibility to contribute to the extent possible to the peace and stability of the South China Sea as well as the Indian Ocean.
したがって今回出雲型の加賀という護衛艦を南シナ海インド洋に派遣をしました。そういう目的で派遣しました。
And that is the reason why we sent our Izumo, the Kaga, which is a full carrier, to the South China Sea.
それで出雲についてはもともとこれは多機能な船である。
So I would just like to tell you a little bit more about Izumo. It is a multifunctional ship. It's a carrier.
で今回、この出雲についてストーブル機を乗せることができるかどうかについて、検討を始めることになりました。
So, ストーブル機、ちょっと待ってください。
ストーブは、ショートスタンド and vertical.
The stove. So we were looking into the possibility of adding the stove function to this Izumo multifunctional carrier.
でこれも多機能の一つとして機能を加えるということです。
So we have to look at it simply as an addition to an already multifunctional carrier.
したがって皆さんが考えるようなフルキャリアではありません。
So I would like to please rectify that it does not make Izumo a full carrier. Can't hear you. Can't hear you.
Is Asia receptive to the expansion of Japan?
こういった日本がですね、そのインド洋ですとか南シナ海に拡大していくことに対してアジアがそれを受領するかどうかです。
これについて我々今 ASEAN 各国それからインド、スリランカと非常に協力関係を結んでおりますので、これに対しては全く我々を好意的に受け止めてもらっております。
All we can say is that we have wonderful cooperative relations with all the ASEAN countries, with India and with Sri Lanka, and they have welcomed this presence of Japan.
でこの展開を通して、協力関係を進化し、なおかつ、キャパシティビルもやっていくという方針で、行動しています。
So all of our activities are primarily directed, the more this kind of development is happening with Japan and the other countries in ASEAN and India and Sri Lanka, we are looking at deepening our cooperation and also in providing support for capacity building.
Okay, we have a question just here.
Thank you. Am I audible? Yes.
Yes.
My question is primarily to General Campbell, and I'm picking up from your words regarding addressing shared concerns together, and I presume China is included in that together. The problem that I see is that China has not really been too concerned about addressing things together. It's been acting unilaterally more often than not. At what stage are we going to keep on, at what stage are we going to give up hoping to be able to address concerns together? And when are we going to realize that it's not going to happen?
Thank you. And I'll just take a question here and then at the back.
Brigadier Malingam, I have
Hello.
a question.
Sorry.
That is,
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you.
my question is that today you have two initiatives. One sponsored by China, the Belt and Road Initiative, and the second sponsored by US, the Indo-Pacific Initiative. Now the point is, as far as the Belt and Road Initiative is concerned, China talks of interconnectivity, infrastructure, development, and integration with the country concerned. Whereas Indo-Pacific speaks only about containing China. That is, and it appears to be, it is a defensive sort of a measure that we are trying to undertake. My point is, in spite of the fact there are going to be a tremendous amount of economic strains on the countries are still accepting Belt and Road Initiative, but on the contrary, the Indo-Pacific, including the Quad, do not have many takers. There are already signs that it is not progressing well. My question is, can these initiatives, such initiatives, progress any further without the economic content in it?
Thank you. And just the gentleman at the back.
In spite of the award of UNCLOS, we have seen how quickly China has militarized the 9-dash line. And you talked about the freedom of navigation exercises happening, and now more and more navies are joining that. We see on our TV screens CNN going on the planes, flying over those islands, and the Chinese saying that you're flying over our airspace, and the Americans saying these are international airspace. And do you actually see that one of these days there could actually be an incident that could happen? The ships were all very close just a few weeks ago, and if something does happen, what could be the consequence of that? And the second question is that, you know, we are seeing everybody is ratcheting up the rhetoric and actually walking the talk in terms of more and more militarization of that region. But Admiral, how do you see the next 5 or 10 years? What do you see happening in that region? Are we just going to see that more and more military sort of build up, and at the same time, maybe, you know, the China continuing building and making the noises, and similarly you, that is other alliances sort of doing it, and nobody actually doing anything about it, so it satisfies everyone's domestic agenda.
Okay, thank you. General Campbell, there was a question to you about China. You're talking about communities and alliances, but China continues to act unilaterally.
Yes, thank you very much. Look, if I hadn't been clear earlier, Australia is very alert to issues such as the South China Seas, security concerns. We don't support unilateral action in the South China Sea. We've made that very clear. We support negotiated settlements, but we support those nations who are claimant states engaging, finding peaceful resolution. We acknowledge and recognise the Arbitral Commission decision in regard to the status of those features. We don't like militarisation. We've made it consistently clear, not just to China, but to regional partners year on, year off. I don't think there's been any question that your question was about unilateral action. I think you were referring to unilateral action that is understood to be outside of this, what we call broadly the rules-based order. We do not support that. And we think that the right thing to do is to reinforce an international rules-based order that is understood by the community of nations, that works to support that community of nations. Otherwise, you see circumstances such as the second or third speaker was raising with regard to concerns over militarisation, potential for incidents leading to escalation and so forth. Those are not areas that we wish to see nations proceed down, and that's why that broad rubric of the work within international order is much preferred over unilateral action by any and all. Thank you.
There was a question. Sorry, did you want to go? Yeah. Yeah.
まず自由で開かれたインド太平洋構想について申し上げます。
I would just like to put in a few words about a free and open Indo-Pacific.
海洋というのはやはり自由で開かれて全ての人たちのものだというのがいわゆるグローバルコモンだということが原則だと思います。
I think in principle what we must understand that the ocean is free and open for all, and hence it is a global commons.
それで今ここにいる5カ国のメンバーについては5カ国はこの価値観を今共有しております。
And the 5 people you see here on the panel today, all the 5 countries share this particular value and philosophy.
したがって今この5カ国では全て特にフランスについては太平洋では海洋国家、あとは海洋国家だと思います。
And of course, I can say that all of us are marine-based countries. I mean, of course, not so much France, but yes, we all are.
それで今南シナ海において中国が人工島ですよね、人工島の試みに見られるように一方的に国際法を無視した行動に出ております。
And I feel in the South China Sea, especially, China has been taking a unilateral action and in violation of international laws.
でしたがってここを我々は価値観が相入れないところである。
And I think this is where we feel there is a difference in the values that we share with China.
したがって中国が我々と同じ価値観に立ってもらえれば、中国と十分協力していけると思います。
So I feel that if China can come to a position where they can share the same values as we do, we can cooperate and work together with them also.
Thank you. There was a question about the One Belt, One Road and that sort of proposing initiatives, whereas the Indo-Pacific talks mainly about containing China. But I suppose my question to that then is, if you look at Pakistan, if you look at Sri Lanka, if you look across the African continent, there are talks of predator lenders, you know, where roads are built and ports are built and actually they've been abandoned and these countries have been left in debt. So, I mean, how do you respond to that, Admiral Davidson, when there is this feeling that the One Belt, One Road is actually a successful initiative when perhaps on the ground it isn't necessarily?
Yeah. To be clear, the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy is not a containment strategy for China. It is advocacy for free nations in terms of security, values, political systems, and the right and the freedom to choose their own partners. Importantly, they're also supposed to be free from coercion, and I think that's where your point on the One Belt, One Road comes in. It's clear, and the Vice President spoke about this plainly last fall. It's not an inclusive, but an exclusive predatory investment path for China. One of the first things I did when I assumed command was to go to Shangri-La, and all the buzz was about Hamid Toda Port in Sri Lanka at Shangri-La that week. I think that has, in many respects, resulted in the convergence of approaches, really by all the nations you see here and others, around an idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific. I say quite frequently that when you look back on the rules-based international order over the last 70 years, you know, it has delivered a level of peace and prosperity, lifted billions actually out of poverty in all our nations. It's an important part of that rules-based international order. And it's been underwritten in many respects by the combat credibility, not only in the United States forces, but in the forces arrayed here on the panel. I think that's incredibly important to sustain as we think about how we're going forward. But I want to be clear, we're not asking people to choose between us and China. That's not what the free and open Indo-Pacific is. And the strategy itself is not a containment strategy.
We've got time for about 2 more questions. Just this gentleman standing up here, and then I'll take one just at the back.
Yeah, my name is Commodore Wasan. I represent the Chennai Center for China Studies and the National Maritime Foundation. The question is addressed to Chief of Defence Staff Australia. This is again on the Quad. You know, we seem to be not very clear. My perception is based on what's in the open source. You know, from 2007, we waited for 10 years before again it could be implemented. And there seems to be a certain amount of reluctance because of what China feels about this alliance of democracies. So again, last year, apparently Australia was left out of this. I'm not sure what the ground situation was, but it appeared that Australia, despite its request, was not allowed for whatever geopolitical considerations there are. So in this context, how do you see the future of Quad? No, it should not purely remain as a military alliance, obviously. It should also encompass CR and HIDR, and now it should be perhaps more receptive. So in the assessment of Australia, how do you look at the future of Quad, and how can we make this succeed? Thank you.
And sorry, we've got just a question right at the back.
Thank you. My name is Danson Svetov. I'm a researcher from Russia. My short question to the Quad part of the panel is there a particular reason you could share with us why there has not been a joint Quad statement up to now? Is there not enough consensus, or what is the reason for that? Thank you.
Thank you. So a couple of questions about the Quad, the future of the Quad. Why isn't there a joint statement from the Quad? You know, where is this heading? I think General Campbell, you.
Sure. Thanks for the questions. When I or my colleagues come to dialogues such as Raisina, questions regarding a thing called the Quad are very common. You all think it's a good idea. That's why you keep asking about it, year after year. I agree with our Minister, Minister Payne, who spoke earlier, and in one of the answers to a question she received about the Quad yesterday, amongst a field of questions about the Quad that she received yesterday, her answer was, it will grow organically as the nations participating wish it to. That's the way bilateral relationships, multilateral relationships, institutional arrangements emerge. But you're all asking the question because there's, from your point of view, I think, some value in it. Now, is it a community of 4 particular nations? Is it the 5 nations here? Is it 6 nations with Indonesia about to be the 4th or 5th largest economy on the planet? Is it 7 nations? I don't mind what it is. I think it's a coming together of strategic views that make it worthwhile having a dialogue and having engagements in various forms, bilateral, trilateral, quadrilateral, quintilateral, multilateral, because we have common interests in an open, free Indo-Pacific. And so you're going to keep asking the questions. I think we're going to continue to be interested in the opportunities emerging organically as they will. Thank you.
Can I add something?
Yeah, of course.
When you look at Indo-Pacific and the Quad and the questions which are being raised on it, at the moment, the 4 nations who have been having a dialogue on the Quad, this thing, represents open, inclusive, free, rule-based, who honor international rules and agreements. And I think that is where is the value of the Quad. And this is only going to grow as time goes by. Not only the nations representing honor international rules-based order and agreements, like in case of India, we have also honored the judgments of the International Court of Justice on the maritime boundary dispute between us and Bangladesh, and we have implemented that agreement. I think that's one of the main reasons what the Quad represents.
But the Quad doesn't represent a military aspect.
True, at the moment it doesn't.
Just a question. Sorry, just one at the very back, and then I'll come to you, sir. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Hazel, and I'm a commodities trader from Singapore. So my question is, how do you see ASEAN playing a part of this military partnership, considering the South China Sea is very much about Southeast Asia? Thank you.
Thank you. And just here. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
I am General Ashok Mehta. Well, I have got a very small question, basically starting with Japanese situation. Japan is the only country in the world which has suffered nuclear destruction. And now, Japan has got a threat just across the border. Now, in the first place, if in 45 Japan was nuclear capable, they won't have come under the nuclear attack. So now, what does the Japan feel? That are they on the threshold for developing nuclear potential as a deterrence? The same thing would extend maybe Australia in due course.
Thank you. Admiral, did you want to? Yeah, sorry, it's transition.
ASEAN との関係について申し上げます。
I would first like to answer about what you think the Southeast Asian countries would think of this partnership.
まず自由で開かれたインド太平洋構想というのは、これは全ての国に開かれているということです。
I would just like to first mention, we go back to what this concept is called. It is a free and open Indo-Pacific, which means that it's free and open to all.
したがって、ASEAN 各国、それから、太平洋島諸国も我々の重要なパートナーです。
Which means that even the various countries in the ASEAN region and other smaller countries in the Indo-Pacific are important partners for us.
ただ今ここにいる5カ国についてはある程度の海軍力を持っているので、まずはこの5カ国でイニシアチブを取るのがいいのではないかという意味です。
However, the 4 countries or 5 that you see here today, the Quad as you call it, are those countries which have considerable naval power, and it was thought natural for these 4 countries to take the initiative on this.
それと核兵器の問題については、我々不幸にも1945年に核の経験を受けております。
And now coming back to the issue of nuclear armament, yes, it was a very unfortunate incident in 1945 that Japan had to suffer.
したがって核の経験があるからこそ核兵器は持たないというのが日本の強力な方針になっております。
So that actually is the reason that it makes Japan's stance very strong. That is exactly the reason why Japan will not go for nuclear armament.
したがって今の北朝鮮の核問題についてもこういう観点から核の拡散という観点から我々としては極めて強い懸念を持っているわけです。
And for that reason also, we have very grave concerns with regard to North Korea and its plans for nuclear disarmament. Nuclear proliferation.
Okay, fair enough. Well, on that note, we've
last question.
Sorry? I'm sorry, we've run out of time, unfortunately, but you can, I'm sure, okay, go ahead. I'll give you like 30 seconds to ask a question.
To General Admiral Davidson, 4 years back, your predecessor said on this platform that India and US, we hope that they'll do joint patrols. So do you see the time has come for it, given the developments and both bilaterally and multilaterally in the last 4 years? And on that note, what tangible steps do you see for the Quad countries going forward?
Yeah, no, that's fine. So could you just repeat that question? Sorry.
Yeah. What is the status of joint patrols, which Admiral Harry Harris had mentioned 4 years back on the same platform?
Joint patrols. It's a question about joint patrols.
4 years back.
4 years ago.
Yeah. He said he hoped they'll be able to do one. So has the time come for that?
I'm sorry, joint patrols where?
India-US joint patrols?
He's asking about joint patrols with Harris had said in the South China Sea.
I welcome operations, exercises in the South China Sea, indeed freedom of navigation ops, from truly any other nation. I'd welcome India. One of the things that has transpired in the last few months is Admiral Kawano and I actually had a couple of ships do an exercise in the South China Sea in the September timeframe. I think it's quite powerful, not only to demonstrate the freedom of the seas for the both of us, but to let the other nations know on the rim of the South China Sea, and absolutely let the ASEAN nations know that it's in our collective interest to have a free and open seas and airways in the South China Sea, so critical to them. I do think, and additionally, with the patrols, it's the responsibility of all of us up here to help the ASEAN nations in this discussion of a code of conduct with China. You know, to make sure that the international rights and freedoms that have been long established in maritime law don't end up as restrictions for the ASEAN nations alone. We cannot have in the maritime environment the kind of thing where the strong do what they will and the weak do what they must. And that is the purpose of patrols by any nation in the South China Sea.
Admiral, thank you for talking through that cold. And thank you to all the panelists for their insights and analysis. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could just thank the panelists.
Excuse me. Because there's no lady ask a question. Can you give me just 1 minute?
I'm so sorry. We've run out of time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
We have some gifts for our speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we're breaking for a tea break right now. You can join us back in 15 minutes.